have discovered the Hidden Bookcase. Book 1, Fritz Wiessner and the Cursed Mountain, K2. We will be delivering to you fantastic tales that have a place in history, myth, or both. And though some of these tales may be hard for you to believe, they all have a root in fact and history. These stories have a special place in our hearts, and we hope it will in yours as well when the music stops and you continue with your daily lives. But until that moment, and for the remainder of this podcast, we invite you to enter into a world of your imagination as we spin for you the thread of this story, where fact and fiction are woven together to create something fantastic. Let's begin. Mountaineering is as old as the New World itself. The first record we have of an official mountaineer was Antoine de Vie, Lord of Domjelion and Beaupré. He climbed Mount Aiguille in 1492. So, there you have it. Mountaineering is as old as the New World itself. Well, no, not exactly. That isn't true, though. Mountains have always played a large significance in religion and in culture throughout human history, since they were viewed to be gateways to heaven itself. Was it not from the top of Mount Sinai that Moses emerged with the 10 Commandments after meeting with God face to face? Did not the ancient Greeks believe that Mount Olympus was the dwelling place of the gods themselves? Even before then, humans have always had a fascination with the stars and what could be out there, and the mountains were always the closest thing to bring them there. Despite this, mountaineering did not become an official sport until the 1850s, when the snazzy Sir Alfred Wills made it fashionable. It was at this time that mountaineering started to take off in mountainous regions around Europe, such as the Bernese Alps. These early climbers used a series of ropes, ladders, and pickaxes to make their way up to peaks of modest difficulties. Though at the time these climbs I'm sure were deemed noble and daring, and for the time period they certainly were. They were just the first generation of serious climbers. Their successors would be the ones that would truly push the envelope. Then, on February 26, 1900, an event occurred that would change the face of mountaineering forever. This, of course, was the birth of German climber Fritz Wiessner. Fritz had climbing in his blood. He started climbing with his father before the outbreak of World War I, and by the age of 12 or 15, depending on which source you trust, he climbed the Zugspitze, the highest peak in all of Germany. By the time Fritz was in his 20s, he established new and incredibly difficult climbs in Saxon Germany and the Dolomites in Italy. Fritz was not exactly an imposing specimen of strength or size. He was only 5'6". However, this could have helped him in the long run, because big burly men usually have a more difficult time clinging to the side of a frozen mountain 20,000 feet in the air. Whatever he looked like, he was an absolute master of his craft, and his method of wide crack climbing, known as off-width, required an immense amount of strength and complete technical mastery, and Fritz had ample amounts of both. In 1920, Fritz emigrated to the United States, and climbers of the Western Hemisphere were in trouble. He immediately started just absolutely destroying previous rock climbing records and establishing climbs that to this day are both feared and revered. There's a long list of heroic and perhaps insane climbs he established in this time frame, but I'll spare you the boring details by just saying that it's often said Fritz Wiessner's climbing in North America at this time established a new standard for climbing. In a few years, he was going to make an attempt on the second tallest mountain in the world, the most technically difficult mountain to climb, and easily the most respected, but also the most feared mountain to ever grace the planet. I'm talking, of course, of the infamous K2. In order to understand the sheer scope of this Herculean task Fritz was about to undertake, you need to fully understand this mountain. To start off, there are only 14 mountains in the world that measure in at an altitude 8,000 meters or above. Notably, these mountains have their own class called, yep, you guessed it, 8,000ers. Clever, I know. Obviously, Mount Everest is the tallest of the 8,000ers, measuring in at 29,029 feet, just a few feet shy of where your typical commercial jet flies. At this height, we also have something known as the death zone. Though I'm sure most of you who are listening do not plan to go into the death zone, today, I invite you to come with me into your imagination further, for a brief moment to understand and comprehend perhaps the most hostile subsection of planet Earth itself. Come with me to the death zone. The death zone is a very serious term to all mountaineers who hear it. It's not the place you want to be for more than a few minutes, even if you come prepared to take it on. Typically starting anywhere above 8,000 meters in the sky, the low atmospheric pressure creates an environment with only 30% the amount of oxygen there is at sea level. Someone like me from Louisiana who's used to breathing in fresh sea air can only be able to last a few minutes before fainting and falling 26,000 feet to the base of the mountain, where death greets them coldly. The way modern climbers combat this is by bringing their own oxygen with them. However, the real hardcore, and I would argue true climbers, leave the oxygen tank behind because either they want to prove to nature that they can tough it out, or because they know that you just simply can't rely on the tank of oxygen to help you when you really may need it. Just imagine this. You're clinging to the frozen side of a mountain, steadily making your way at 26,000 feet in the air, and suddenly something goes wrong with your oxygen. The thing you breathe in to give you life. And you're in the death zone. Maybe you start to panic. One wrong move, you're dead. Maybe you keep your cool and keep pressing forward undeterred. Then you start to get this strange feeling in your head. First a headache, then full-on disorientation. You may be suffering from edema of the brain. This is caused by the lack of oxygen in the blood, literally leaking blood into the brain, causing it to swell. This only causes more disorientation and confusion, and then sometimes nausea and vomiting, and in extreme cases, it can even cause death. As I said, one wrong move up there, and that's it. The death zone claims its title, and the mountain claims yet another victim. Out of all the 200 plus poor souls who have died on Mount Everest, most of them died in the death zone. In Fritz Wiessner's journey to the top of K2, he spent nearly 5 whole days at an altitude just below the death zone, some 25,000 feet in the air, with no oxygen to support him whatsoever. When I say this guy is the real deal, this guy is the real deal. So now we know a little bit about Everest and the death zone. Sounds pretty foreboding, doesn't it? K2 is only 800 feet shorter than Everest, so they make a good side-by-side comparison of one another. Not to discredit the tallest mountain in the world, but when comparing the difficulty of climbing Everest to climbing K2, Everest simply doesn't even come close. Everest is more of a tourist destination now more than anything, and since the 1980s, alpinists have turned the mountain into a way to make money by leading amateur climbers up the mountain to say they've conquered the tallest of all peaks, which, yes, is still impressive, but these amateur expeditions are almost always the stories you hear that end in catastrophe. If you don't have a good troop with you, things can start going badly quickly. Most of the dead who remain on Everest were inexperienced climbers, simple as that. On the flip side, you could be one of the greatest climbers to ever walk the earth, and you would still have the same 1 in 4 chance of not making it off K2. The mountain is a freak of nature, and horrific occurrences can easily happen on every expedition that kill even the best of climbers. Consider this. Since Everest was first summited in 1953, more than 4,000 people have summited. And around the same time frame, just over 300 people have summited K2. So, to take on this mountain is near suicide. So why are people crazy enough to continue to do it? Is that just human nature? Consider this now. In Ed Viester's book, K2, Life and Death on the World's Most Dangerous Mountain, one of the climbers describes approaching the base of K2 as follows. It is the most beautiful of all peaks. An artist has made this mountain. Australian climber Greg Child describes it like this, quote, K2 just has something about it. Partly it's the shape and beauty and symmetry of the thing, and partly it's the infamy. The stories of what happened to people who've tried it, how effed up they've become, and how many have died, end quote. Isn't that interesting, though? The most beautiful of all peaks is also the most deadly. It's time we go back to our old pal Fritz. The stage has been set for him. The year is 1938. The American Alpine Group has been granted permits to attempt to climb the mountain K2 for 2 subsequent years. Legendary American mountaineer Charles Houston sets out on the first American expedition with a group of young climbers and Sherpas, making the 3rd attempted climb of the mountain in history after Aleister Crowley, yes, that Aleister Crowley, and Prince Luigi Amadeo, Duke of Abruzzi. Also, for those of you who do not know who the Sherpas are, they are an ethnic group native to the mountains of Nepal and the Himalayas. They are among the most elite climbers, and on many expeditions in modern times, in fact, most of them, the Sherpas are hired to fix ropes for climbers to use before they begin their ascent. The American Alpine Group's mission was simple: to survey the peaks of the mountain and perform reconnaissance for the follow-up expedition next year, 1939. Should the opportunity to summit present itself, then the team should of course seize it. After weeks of grueling up the mountain and testing the 5 potential routes they found, supplies were dwindling, and so were spirits. It was time to turn around. However, to say the expedition was not a successful one would be unfair to those men. They had established 7 camps along the route and had climbed higher than any man had ever been in history. Now, the year is 1939. With the 1938 American Karakoram expedition establishing a reliable route up the mountain, it was time for Fritz Wiessner to take his shot at K2. So, in the summer of 1939, with one last-minute addition, Fritz set out with a team of 6 Americans: Eaton Cromwell, George Sheldon, Chapel Cranmar, Dudley Wolfe, and Jack Durrance, the last-minute addition. They were also joined by a British transport officer named Lieutenant George Trench, and 8 Sherpa named Lama, Dawa, Kikuli, Sering, Finsu, Tendrup, Kitar, and Sonam. The team was as good as it was going to get, and it was now time to seize the day. So up the mountain they climbed. And of course, setbacks began almost immediately. Due to Durrance's last-minute guest appearance, his proper climbing boots didn't arrive until 4 weeks into their trek. So, the maximum height he could climb with improper boots was set at 20,000 feet, a near 8,000 feet shy of the summit, limiting the team and carrying capacity of the troop right out the gate. The second mishap on the road up the mountain was also due to improper equipment. Plain and simple, they didn't get enough climbing goggles. So, who was going to get the short end of the stick, huh? None other than their 3 porters. They suffered snow blindness before they even made it up to the mountain and were sent home empty-handed. The loads were divided amongst Durrance, Cranmer, Sheldon, and Trench, making their loads double the weight that it already was, and making the trek much more difficult and tiring than it was already going to be. One of the overloaded climbers, Cranmer, had his health decline into a state of near death while trying to retrieve an object. He began vomiting a clear liquid and complaining about extreme confusion. Not the thing you want to be happening when you're some 20,000 feet up in the air. Many weeks into the expedition, morale was drastically depleting. Continuous storms bombarded the troop, and soon enough both a mental and physical gap was created within the expedition. In reality, though some of the men stayed on the mountain a little bit, all that remained of the expedition team was Wiessner, Wolfe, and Pasang Dawalama, their Sherpa. On July 18th, Fritz decided he was going to go for it. Leaving from Camp 9, 26,050 feet in the air, he was within striking distance of the top. He and the Sherpa Dawalama made the push, leaving Wolfe at Camp 8 with ample supplies, but alone on the harsh mountain. The final climb began. Fritz pushed ahead with rope and crampon, pickaxe and boot, and a whole lot of sheer will and courage. After hours of climbing, The time was 6:30 p.m., and the duo's attack had brought them at an altitude of 27,000 feet, a mere 700 feet from the summit. The rest of the trek would be a mere stroll compared to the treachery that lay below them, and Fritz was ready to finish it. I like to imagine what was going through Fritz's head at this moment. His life's work was about to culminate in its greatest success. The world and all its problems, all of these were literally miles below him. He was at the highest point any man had ever been in history, with space seemingly within his grasp. Fritz Wiessner was at the cradle of heaven, though he had to go through hell to get there. But, as his Sherpa would regrettably inform him, hell was all that the mountain had to offer. According to Pasang Dawalama, his people believed that this mountain was cursed, and that evil spirits claimed the mountain as their own. If they pressed forward, they would have to descend in the shadow of night, and Dawalama sensed a bad omen in the thin air. He told Fritz that the only thing waiting for him on the summit, a mere 700 feet away, were demons ready to curse him for intruding on their territory. Dawalama would not budge. Fritz reluctantly took the Sherpa's advice and headed back to Camp 9 for the night. It's okay, it wasn't the end of the world. They would give it another shot tomorrow. But unfortunately for Fritz, that tomorrow never came. During their descent, Dawalama lost his crampons, an essential component for climbing. The tactic the duo would have to use in order to attempt another summit would simply have taken too much time, so they decided they would head back to Camp 8 to resupply. But of course, in coordinates with the rest of the expedition, things did not go as planned. Wolf informed them that no supplies had come from the others. Desperate and cold, the trio made their way back to Camp 7. And this is where things went from discouraging to bad, and then to really, really bad. Camp 7 was completely deserted and gutted from supplies. The previous expedition members packed everything up and took it with them. Not only that, but Wolf lost his mattress on the way down, so the trio spent the night in a cramped tent with one mattress and sleeping bag between all three of them. For a reason that probably was caused by lack of sleep, extreme frustration, and confusion, Wolf decided to stay at Camp 7 the next day, while Fritz and Dawalama descended to Camp 6 for supplies. By this point though, you could probably guess what they found at Camp 6. Nothing but a deserted campsite and taken down tents. The two descended from camp to camp, only to find that every one of them had been abandoned, eventually making it to base camp, both exhausted and nearly frozen to death. Wolf was still left behind though, in the freezing cold, at Camp 7, 24,000 feet in the air. A rescue party of Sherpa was sent for him. On August 9th, they were all presumed dead. Years later, in the early 2000s, it was discovered that the Sherpa never even made it to Wolf. He died alone, but the view that he was exposed to was, after all, to die for. K2 had taken its first 4 recorded victims. The great play was over, and so was this expedition. It was time to go home. Upon his return to America, Fritz was met with stark interrogation as to why he had left Dudley Wolf on the mountain. The Second World War had broken out at this point, and the authorities pointed to Fritz's German nationality. This, of course, was ridiculous. The fact of the matter was that Dudley Wolf was an overweight and inexperienced climber who had amazingly made it all the way to the top of the world's most treacherous environment. The fact he even made it that far is astounding. If the blame was to be put on anybody, it would be the expedition team who stripped campsites of tents and sleeping bags and basically forced Fritz and Dawalama down the mountain and essentially left them to die. Though, I suppose it would be unjust to say Fritz was completely innocent in the matter. He wasn't. He wanted to summit this mountain badly, and I frankly don't think he cared much whether anyone else summited with him. This was, after all, his whole life's work. If the rest of the team wasn't ready to trek forward, let them stay behind. Forget about him. It's an interesting scenario to ponder and philosophize over. If you were that close to achieving your greatest accomplishment, would you wait for the stragglers on your team? Or call the whole thing off? Or would you move up that icy slope with whoever was willing or crazy enough to come along for the ride. Perhaps the fault lies in the fact that Fritz was ill-prepared from the get-go, and he let his personal ambition get in the way of safety of the others around him, people that he was responsible for as the expedition leader. Then when he was backed into an icy corner, he had to make a tough decision. One that cost 4 men their lives. Like I said, it's an interesting story to consider. And before you judge Fritz, think of what you would have done had this story been about you. Thanks for tuning in.